Hello. I'm very excited to be here to talk about accessibility with you today. Accessibility is this huge topic. It covers so many different things. These are just a few of the things that exist on iOS, and Apple has a huge commitment to accessibility across all of their platforms. So I only have 25 minutes, so I'm actually just going to focus on these three. So I'm going to focus on voice control, voiceover, and switch control. And really, the title of the talk should have been how UI accessibility relates to voiceover, switch control, and voice control, but it's not quite as snappy as the accessibility API. And so my goal at the end of the talk is that you know what to do to make your app accessible to those three assistive technologies. So there's 4 parts that we'll look at. The first is understanding how accessive technology works, and then we'll look at how to make an accessibility user interface. We'll briefly look at how to test, and then how to make it part of your workflow. So step 1, understanding how assistive technologies work. So a lot of times when we talk about accessibility, there's this big focus on disability, that the user is disabled in some way. And this always annoys me, because people kind of start narrowing how they view users, because they start thinking about what the user can and can't do. But really, accessibility is just about providing an alternative way to interact with the device. So an assistive technology basically defines a specific set of inputs and/or outputs of how the user is going to interact with the device. So let's look at the user interface for Clock. It's a beautiful app. So user interface is composed of elements. So we've got buttons at the top, like edit and add. We've got a table view, and we've got a tab bar at the bottom. Now, some of these elements are interactable, right? I can tap on them. I can, on the table view, I can even swipe to delete. I can add cities. I can change tabs. And some of the elements are just static text, so I can't actually interact with them. Now, without an assistive technology, the user interface for this, the input is I can touch the screen, and the output is it just displays stuff on the screen. So VoiceOver, the first assistive technology we'll look at, it basically reads out what's being shown visually on the screen. So I have a short video to demonstrate.
Melbourne, today, plus 14 hours, 19, 18. Tokyo, today, plus 12 hours, 17, 18. Tokyo, today, plus 12 hours. London, today, plus 3 hours, 8.
So I think you get the idea. So basically, there's the kind of rounded rectangle that gets drawn. That's the VoiceOver cursor. The user moves that around on the screen, and VoiceOver reads out basically that element to the user. And VoiceOver is very easy to set up. So basically, you just go into accessibility, settings, accessibility. Is it gonna? Sorry, I'm not sure if the video is playing. Nope. Okay. It is basically you go into settings, accessibility, and then you turn VoiceOver on. You can customize it, so you can. Let's see. Actually, now it might play. Yes. Okay. So you can turn VoiceOver on. You can also change the speed. So if it's speaking too quickly, you can slow it down. If it's going too slow, you can speed it up. And you can also change the language. So if English isn't your first language, you can. I sadly don't speak any Spanish. But yes, so to summarize, VoiceOver, the input is with touches. So the user activates an element on the screen, although with an asterisk, because slightly different way of touching the screen, so they have to usually double tap instead of single tap. And it gets a little bit more complicated for other gestures, but they're still interacting with the screen. And the output of VoiceOver is spoken. So the focused element is read out loud to the user. Although the screen still does show, so the output is also kind of the screen. Okay, so switch control. Switch control, is it playing? Yes, cool. So switch control has a cursor as well. So the red rectangle is basically the switch control cursor, and it cycles through all the elements on the screen. So switch control works with switches, which can be pretty much anything. You can use like the front-facing camera, for example, so it will detect if you've like tilted your head. You can use like a Bluetooth keyboard and map different buttons on a keyboard to be switches. You can also just use the screen on the phone as a switch. And turning switch control on, also very easy. You just go into accessibility settings and then turn on switch control. But you do need to add a switch first before turning it on. Otherwise, you can't really do anything. And so to do that, you just go through switch control switches, add new switch. You select the screen as the switch, and then say that I want it to be a tap. Basically, if I touch the screen, it should equate to a tap for a user. So switch control interface is basically the input is a switch, which can be pretty much anything, could be the screen. And the cursor cycles through the elements on the screen, and then the user basically presses the switch when it's on the element that they want activated. And then the output is just on the screen. Voice control. Who's excited about voice control? Brand new, iOS 13. I'm going to assume that's a lot of enthusiasm, yeah. I know, you've all just had a break. The enthusiasm probably isn't there yet. So yes, in the video clip, you can see kind of at the top, there's a little overlay that shows basically like the commands that I've just told it to do. So like tap add, it should do in a second. Yeah, and then it shows all the cities, and then you can tell it to scroll down. Yes, so it's all about speaking, and then it listens to you, and it does those things. It's magical. Very excited about voice control. So to turn it on, settings, accessibility, voice control, it uses Siri for speech recognition. So at the moment, it only uses American English. So even I have kind of an in-between, not really British, not really American accent. So I try to be a little extra American when I use it. It does make a difference. So sometimes it's a little hit and miss. But yes, so voice control user interface, the input is the voice. So the user speaks commands to activate an element or perform an action. And the output is just on the screen of the device. So all three of these are just alternative ways of interacting with your app. So kind of to summarize all three, VoiceOver, the input is touch, the output is spoken, and also on the screen. Switch control is this input for switch, outputs to the screen. Voice control, voice, output on the screen. And then you can also make it a little more complicated because you can actually turn on multiple things at the same time. You used to be able to turn switch control and VoiceOver on at the same time, but I can't get it to do that anymore. But you can do VoiceOver and voice control, or switch control and voice control. So this is why it's really important to not think about specifically like the needs of the user. Like it's more important to think about like what does the technology provide? Like how is the user going to interact with the technology? Because especially if they can mix and match things, it starts like complicating things way more. So if we look at all three of these side by side, like they're all quite different ways of interacting, but they also have a lot in common. Like the things that VoiceOver sees, switch control sees, and there's kind of labels going on that all look the same. So what they have in common is that they're using all this information to create an accessibility user interface. So when we looked at the clock app before, we highlighted all the elements. And really, it's just kind of like another layer where we're specifying accessibility information to create this accessibility user interface. So the system takes all these elements and their accessibility information to create this accessibility user interface for these assistive technologies. And you provide all of this information through UI accessibility if you're doing UIKit apps. I'm assuming you're not all like on SwiftUI 100% yet. I will mention SwiftUI momentarily, though. So one of my biggest recommendations is to always use like standard UIKit elements. Don't do custom stuff, because you get so much accessibility for free. Like accessibility is awesome, and having it there is really important, but you don't want to be spending hours and hours a day trying to add accessibility support to your app. So I always try to start with like basic stuff, and then if you need to customize it, do it, but you get a lot for free through UIKit. So there's kind of three main basic building blocks for creating an accessibility user interface. And I say basic because there's a ton of other stuff within UI accessibility you can use, but the three things that really make it happen through the assistive technologies is these three. So is accessibility element? This is basically telling the assistive technology, hey, I'm an accessibility element, you need to like tell the user about me. So if we have something like a button, we would definitely want that to be an accessibility element. Again, you wouldn't actually do this because the button by default already has this enabled. But if you have something like a decorative image, like something that isn't actually conveying any information, it's just there for kind of prettiness, then for that you just say, this is not an accessibility element. You also have accessibility traits. So these are really important because these also determine which of these kind of assistive technologies actually see and expose the elements to the user. So for example, like on a button, it would include the accessibility traits of a button. There are, I think, 18 different accessibility traits. And you can combine these, so it doesn't just have to be one. You can combine them and have a very complicated thing depending on what your control is doing. And then the third part is the accessibility label. So this is what is used to describe the element to the user. So again, in this example, we've got the send email, the send button, and its label is send email. So by default, if you're using UIKit stuff, it's just going to use like the title of the button. Be careful about images, because if you don't actually provide an accessibility label for like an image, it will read out the file name of the image, which can sometimes sound pretty terrible to a user. But yeah, so when in doubt, set the label, and obviously always localize strings as well. I was being lazy in the slide here. Sorry. So these are the kind of three things that get it to be usable-ish. It really depends on your app and kind of what your app does. For simple apps, those three things can get you like 95% of the way there. If you have a more complicated app, it might be a little trickier, especially if you have like a really complex view hierarchy. It can be difficult to navigate between items. So those three things will get you to a fairly usable state, but getting it to great, you probably need to look at the rest of what's in UI accessibility. But none of it's really that scary or hard. It's all just kind of settings and properties. So UIKit and SwiftUI. So I haven't spent huge amounts of time playing with SwiftUI and accessibility, but it is a lot better. Like the way that it automatically handles accessibility for you is better. But the same kind of stuff exists in SwiftUI. So you have labels, traits, values, all that. All the same accessibility information is there, and you can change. But the big advantage of SwiftUI is because it is declarative. Like with UIKit, you have to handle like notifications. So if a button changes or something happens on screen, you have to handle that and kind of get things to update. Whereas SwiftUI just kind of takes care of it for you, or so they say. I don't know. So again, we'll look at all three of these kind of side by side, and we can see that, you know, if an element is actionable, VoiceOver can see it, switch control can see it, and voice control sees it as well. And we can also see that, well, you can't hear. You heard the VoiceOver earlier, but basically the thing that VoiceOver reads out is the same thing that voice control shows as its label. So we have these three very different assistive technologies, but they really have a lot in common. And there's a lot of overlap. And the great thing is, like, so before voice control existed, like you basically just get voice control support for free if you're already kind of like adding that accessibility information. But there are some things that don't quite work exactly well. So there are some things that, I don't know, go wrong sounds a little extreme. But so like if I was in voice control and I wanted to activate that button, like what is that button? Like what do I call that button? Is it maybe tap menu, tap hamburger, tap list? One of the cool things about voice control is there's different overlay options. So by default, it shows nothing, and you can just tell it to do things. But if you get in a situation where you're like, I don't actually know what that thing is called, and I want that thing to happen, you can put an overlay on. So the overlay on the left is the names overlay, so it just displays all the different labels. The middle one is the numbers overlay, so it just numbers everything in order. And then the last one is the grid, so you can even customize how many columns and rows there are. And yeah, so if we look a little more closely at this one, that button's actually called Edit Cities, which is not something that I would ever assume to call it. So a slightly more extreme example is like if I wanted to tap on London, I would actually have to say to voice control, London 2034, 50 degrees, which is a pretty bad experience. But they've added accessibility user input labels, so you can specify basically an array of different strings. So in that case, I would, as a user, I would just want to say London. I maybe would want to say 50 degrees, but I don't know. But you can basically provide as many strings as you want, which helps with the user experience. Now, what if you don't actually provide any accessibility user interface? Let's say you want to play Candy Crush. Candy Crush is not accessible. This is basically like VoiceOver just sees nothing. You can't do anything. You just kind of get like the dunk dunk sound with it, which is not nice. Switch control, a little different. So switch control can't see any elements. It goes into the scanning mode. And then you can activate a switch, and then it starts scanning vertically. And then it basically, you end in like a crosshair, which kind of reminds me of the Cylon. And then voice control is really interesting because you can play Candy Crush with voice control. So you put the grid on, and then you can just, go to town, which is awesome. Anyway. So after you've made your app accessible, you then want to actually test the accessibility is working. So devices are the only place where you can actually enable these assistive technologies. It's very important to try using your app with these accessibility assistive technologies enabled. None of them will break anything. You can always ask Siri to turn them off, and turn them on. So if you get stuck, don't worry. There's tons of YouTube videos on how to use them, and really just practice using them. So on the simulator, you can't turn on like VoiceOver, you can't turn on switch control or anything. But what you can use is the accessibility inspector, and that is within Xcode. So if you go into Open Developer Tool and then Accessibility Inspector, and that gives you, basically you can inspect each element and it will tell you what the label is set to, the traits, all that kind of good stuff. So it's a very good way of just kind of making sure everything is where it's supposed to be for kind of debugging things. So yeah, you can also use the accessibility inspector with a device. So if you're trying to debug something, you just plug it into your computer and then open the accessibility inspector and choose your device as the target. And of course, a really great way to just see what are all my VoiceOver labels is you can turn voice control on and then show names, and it will show you basically all the VoiceOver labels for that screen. Now, when you approach testing, there's a lot of different ways to test things, right? But the thing that I recommend the most is trying to test like an entire like user flow. Like if I was in the mail application, it would be like I want to be able to send an email, right? Just checking one screen at a time, you miss a lot of context, which is very important in a lot of these assistive technologies. So try to break your app down into goals and then test each flow. So finally, making accessibility part of your workflow. So accessibility needs to be sustainable. Like, it can't just be this massive thing that you're constantly battling. You need to make sure that you can actually get it working every day for you. So it's important that it's part of every phase. Like, it should be thought about in design, it should be thought about in development, and it should be thought about in testing. And a lot of things that become kind of difficult to solve with accessibility during development could probably just be solved if design had thought about it first. So it's good to try to get designers on board. If you're kind of a team of one who does all of this yourself, it's easier. But if you're in a bigger team, it takes a lot of more coordination. And there's always this concept of like, oh, you should audit your app for accessibility. And I hate this. Audits. Oh. I mean, audits to me are always about like tax and stuff, and so it never sounds like a very positive word to begin with. But the issue I have with audits is it treats it as this kind of one-off thing, like, oh, I'm going to audit my app, and then that's it. Like, I'll fix the things that I find maybe if I have the time, but it's not really making accessibility this kind of continuous flow. And like, I'm pretty sure we all ship updates to our apps from time to time, right? Like it's not like CD-ROMs where you go, here, my app is finished. Like, we submit updates to the App Store. So accessibility is going to have to change over time. So it's important that we make it part of a cycle and not just this kind of one-off thing. So make it, part of every feature. Like, make it, an actual. The definition of done should include accessibility. And also, I know if you've never touched accessibility before, it can feel very overwhelming, but really just start. Like, you'll be amazed at how quickly a lot of it will just happen and take care of itself. So just start, work in small pieces. Because ultimately, like, if you open your app right now and you've never done anything with accessibility, if it's broken, something's probably broken, but you're already shipping something that's broken, so if you break it more, it's okay. Okay, maybe not. But yeah, just start, don't worry. Like, it's always good to start with kind of small things and iterate. Cool. So, that was like a lot to cover. But we've looked at kind of how these assistive technologies work, so voice over switch control and voice control, and how they all use the accessibility user interface. We looked briefly at testing accessibility in your app, and then finally, how to make it part of your workflow. If you have any questions about accessibility, find me. I love to talk to people about accessibility. And there's always, I'm sure you guys have questions. I'm not going to take questions right now, though, but do find me, okay? Thank you.